In this very important video, I'm going to share the secrets for how to begin learning Maya as a complete beginner 3D artist. Maya is a very complex piece of software that can do a lot of things. And as soon as you open that up, you're going to find out how overwhelming it is with so many menus and so many different directions you can take Maya into. Very many different disciplines that you can dive deeper in learning Maya. So every beginner, when they first launch Maya, they're just completely overwhelmed. So I'm going to break this down to you for how to begin learning Maya. Very quickly, I'm going to tell you what you need to focus on. Important terminology, so you know what is being talked about when people mention the type of different modeling methods, what are objects made up of, what are vertices, what are edges, what are faces, and then as well, of course, specific things that you need to do in order to begin Maya in the right direction. Now, before we begin, I do want to mention that I have a very extensive, very in-depth Maya Foundation home study course. This entire course will teach you step by step exactly what you need to know to get started, to model, and to UV using Maya as an absolute beginner. It is a very extensive tutorial course that will outline and show you everything you need to get started. Alright, let's jump right into the video. Why Maya? Maya is the industry standard software that's been around for, as of this video, 24 years. And it is not going away. It's widely used in large to small to independent studios, as well as freelancers, hobbies. There is of course other software that could be used to model, to create game environments, characters, props, animation with, of course. But Maya is by far in its own category, and it's the industry standard for a reason. So I don't use anything else because I use Maya, and I've been using Maya for over 15 years. And I am very good and very quick with modeling and UVing in Maya. And I've tried other software, and in my experience, Maya is the best modeling and UVing application. It is very flexible, it's very efficient, and I know I'm probably very biased because I've been using Maya for so long, but anytime I try to switch, I always come back to my base. I always come back to Maya, and I can pump out models, I can UV those models extremely quickly. So if you want to learn Maya and use Maya, then I'm here to help. And I will teach you how. So how do you get Maya? A lot of people think that Maya is way too expensive and they can't afford it. And that is a big misunderstanding. Maya has two primary subscription plans as of right now. There is the standard version that does cost $1,700 plus annually. And that price may change, go up in time. As of this video, it's $1,700 per year. But there is a far more affordable Maya Indie version that many people don't know about, that only costs $290 annually. And if you go and search for Maya Indie, you'll be able to get to the site, read more about it. And this is the version that I use. It's a full version of Maya with a few caveats of if you can use it. And you just have to make no more than $100,000 per year using Maya to qualify for the Indie version. So this is perfect for small studios, for freelancers, for hobbyists, and for indie developers. And for $290 annually, it's very affordable. And you get the full version of the software to use, just like the AAA studios use. Same Maya. Also, if you are a student, you can get access to Autodesk products that include Maya for 1 full year for free. You can just search for Maya student license and then go to the page and read more about it. This is how many students who are going to college can get access to Maya. And also you have access to free Maya trial for 30 days if you choose to try Maya first. So you have quite a few options. Next, as you begin to learn Maya and Maya modeling, you need to understand few fundamental 3D modeling concepts. So there are different types of words that are used to describe a 3D model. And for a beginner, this is often very confusing because they think it means something different for each of these terms. So you may hear mesh, object, asset, model, static mesh, and all you need to know that all these mean the same thing. It is a 3D model created in Maya or some other software. Different people use different words that signify the same exact thing. Now, a 3D model will be made up of the following components: vertices, edges, and faces. And this is true for two different types of modeling methods, which are going to be polygonal and subdivision. There's another modeling method called spline-based modeling, or NURBS, and we'll talk about these 3 different modeling methods a little later. But when it comes to standard regular modeling that you will be doing, you will be dealing with polygonal objects, that have vertices, edges, and faces. So when it comes to this cube, this is a basic polygonal shape, cube, and it's composed of those three components: vertices, edges, and faces. So I'm going to right click, hold on this object. That allows me to switch from object mode. This is what this is right now. And I'm able to switch to vertices, which are points that have more than two edges connected to it. And you see that we have vertices all over the mesh on corners. You can have vertices anywhere along the edge, and they can be anywhere on the model, but these are vertices. Then you have an edge, which will have two or more vertices connected to it, and we have edges all over this object right here. And then if I right click, hold, and switch over to a face, it also has faces. And the face is made up of three or more edges. So all objects that you will work with will have vertices, edges, and faces. And you'll be switching between all three of these to manipulate them, to move them, to add more or remove, but your object will consist of all three of these components. Now, when it comes to faces, you will hear different terminology describing different types of faces. So there are three different types of faces that you will deal with. Triangles. A triangle is a face with three edges. Then you have a quad, and a quad is a face with four edges. And then you have bad type of faces, which are called n-gons. N-gons are faces with more than four edges. And n-gons is something you want to avoid when you are modeling your objects. You can have them as your model, but you should always clean them up. And the most efficient type of geometry that you want to work with and focus on that all your models have is quads and triangles. And different modeling methods will require you to focus more on quads, where triangles should be minimized, or triangles and quads are usually going to be something that you're going to focus on most of the time. But then we'll talk more about the modeling methods in just a bit. But the one thing you need to know, your model should primarily consist of triangles, faces with three edges, quads, faces with four edges. And anytime you have n-gons, something you want to avoid and clean up to make them into quads or triangles. Next concept you need to understand are UVs. UVing a model will allow you to make textures appear and display on your 3D objects correctly. There are three common terms that you will usually hear: UVing, UV mapping, UV unwrapping. All have slightly different definition, but each is after the same outcome. And instead of going into terminology and theory and telling you what each of these definitions are, I'm going to simplify them into this. It is a process of projecting a 2D texture onto a 3D object. And UVs are texture coordinates of the object. And UV usually translates to X and Y in world space. So basically it is making sure that your object will display whatever texture you apply on that mesh correctly. By default, your objects will not be UV'd. So anytime you apply a texture on them, it will be unreadable. Basically, it'll just be overlapping. It will look horrible. So the process of UVing is you have to lay out all your faces in UV editor. So each face will be laid out flat inside the UV editor to make sure that the texture will be applied and displayed correctly on your mesh. And it's a whole separate subset of techniques, editors, and tools you need to use to UV your objects. And it's often a very frustrating process for a complete beginner to understand and to use UVs. But there is a method, there is techniques, and UVing is actually pretty simple once you get over of understanding of how 3D objects translate to a flat 2D space. And I go over exactly what you need to know to get started with UVs in the course. But in the end, each object you model, if you're going to apply texture to it, has to be unwrapped so you can see the textures on it correctly. There are three primary modeling methods you need to know about: polygonal, subdivision, and NURBS. Each is used for different type of output. So let me go through each of these and talk about what they're used for and some of the principles behind it. So the first one is polygonal modeling. In polygonal modeling, meshes are composed of vertices, edges, and faces. They can be high poly or low poly depending on the project and depending on your output. Polygonal modeling is what's used in games. And if you are going into games or you are working in games, then polygonal modeling is what you are using. This is the most common modeling method you'll be using and the one you should focus on learning. So in Maya, if you go to Create drop-down menu Here you have polygon primitives that you can use to create or begin creating your objects using these primitives. So this is what you're going to be accessing in order to create these meshes. So you can start from them. So you have sphere, you have your cube, you have your cylinder, and so on. These are your polygonal objects that you start your 3D models from. The second modeling method is subdivision modeling. This uses polygonal objects to create high poly and high quality meshes. So you start from the basic primitive polygonal shapes, just like I showed you, but there's an extra step, an extra modeling technique that you have to utilize in order to make subdivision modeling work. And the result that you end up with is a higher poly, high quality objects. This is mainly used for film, for animation, for high quality renders, and for high poly sculpt prep. Subdivision modeling is not directly used in games, but it can be used to create high poly meshes in order for you to bake normal maps, as well as prep for the sculpt. When you use subdivision modeling, you have to smooth your meshes, and they are smoothed or subdivided in Maya. And in fact, when you use subdivision modeling, there is 3 primary shortcut keys that you'll be switching to a smooth mesh preview or subdivision preview to see what your mesh would look like if you were to subdivide it or if you were to smooth it out. And the subdivision preview mode is toggled by using the 3 hotkey. You press 1 to go back to your original polygonal mode mesh, and 3 to check out what the smooth version, the subdivided preview mode of your mesh would look like. In order to make subdivision modeling work, it requires you to be very focused on placing holding edges to prevent your mesh from collapsing. So here I have 2 cubes. This is the default cube. When you go to create polygon primitives cube, and to see what the subdivided mesh would look like of this cube, you press 3 on the keyboard when the object is selected. This is going to give you a preview that if you were to use subdivision modeling, what that mesh is going to look like. You press 1 to go back to original polygonal shape. This is your regular polygonal modeling. So for subdivision modeling, it requires you to input holding edges in order to prevent the model from collapsing. So here's a cube, and I inserted holding edges on each corner. So if I select this one and press 3, it's going to retain its shape, and it's going to smooth out or subdivide the cube. So now I have a higher poly, higher resolution, high quality cube that has a slight corner bevel to it, and that is used in subdivision modeling method. And there's one more shortcut key. If you press 2, this will give you a low poly cage of the original mesh, as well as the preview for the high poly, the subdivided cube. So the 3 shortcut keys is 1 for low poly object, 2 for low poly cage and the high smooth preview, and 3 is your smooth mesh preview without the low poly cage. So the way you model your objects for subdivision modeling is different than polygonal modeling. And you would only use subdivision modeling for the output if it's required for you to use this modeling method. And one last thing about subdivision modeling, primarily it should contain all quads with minimal triangles in order for the mesh to subdivide and smooth correctly. Now triangles are okay with subdivision modeling, but sometimes they will cause some pinching in your geometry that will not look good. And the third modeling method is NURB modeling, also known as spline-based modeling. Now these objects are composed of splines and control vertices, or CVs, and they do not contain vertices, edges, or faces like you would expect in polygon or subdivision mode. So the way you work with NURB modeling is a lot different than with polygon or subdivision. NURB modeling is not used in games, and it's primarily used for engineering and industrial design. And it's not something you're going to be using unless you are in a specific industry that requires you to use NURB modeling. But for games, you're not going to be using NURB modeling at all. However, there are times when you use a NURB modeling technique, which then you can convert your NURB models into polygons. You will find NURB primitives to create under Create, NURB primitives, and here are the basic shapes that you can begin with. So if I go ahead and do a sphere, and let me scale it up. When you right click on the NURB primitive or NURB object, you'll have a whole different set of components to switch to. Isopoints, control vertices, and so on. So these are NURB surfaces. And for those of you who are starting out and you want to get into games, then primarily focus on polygonal modeling. This is going to be your go-to for anything you create. And then once you've gotten into polygonal modeling and you're very good with it, then you can explore subdivision modeling. And these are two great methods to begin and to hone in your modeling skills. So start with polygonal modeling, that's going to be your 80%, and know how to do subdivision modeling when you need it. And that's going to be your 20%. Now, I don't need to tell you how complex Maya can be and how in depth you can get depending on what discipline you're going to use Maya for. But I want to point out a few things to kind of wrap your head around so you can kind of focus in on exactly what you're going to use Maya for. So the first thing is the menu set. Right here at the top left. By default, it will be set to modeling, but you can switch over to any different menu set, thus giving you extra options in the drop-down menu that are not available right now. So if you switch over to, let's say, animation, the first 6 icons, or actually the first 7, are going to stay the same, but then the rest are going to be changed depending on what menu set you switch to. So if I switch over to FX, you get a new set of menus. And I'm going to switch back to modeling because that's what I use Maya for. And then you get access to the modeling drop-down menus. So be aware of this. If you're not seeing something that you're supposed to, just make sure that you switch this to whatever you are using Maya for. And then you also have workspaces right here at the top right. You can switch your workspace and let Maya adjust its interface to maximize what you are using Maya for. So by default, I usually use general, and then sometimes I would switch to UV, but you have other workspaces you can work with. So for example, if you want to switch to modeling standard, it removes a lot of the clutter in the interface that you don't need. You can switch to UV editing, or you can switch to other workspaces that are available. When you begin with Maya, the first thing you want to master is navigation. And navigation in Maya is extremely simple. You just need to know a set of hotkeys and then just begin practicing by working with basic primitive shapes so you can master the navigation. The first shortcut key is the spacebar. If you hover your mouse inside the viewport and press the spacebar, this will switch you over to a 2x2 view. And then if you want to maximize a specific view, just simply place your mouse inside that viewport and press the spacebar again. And this is an extremely quick way to maximize any viewport or to restore a 2x2 view so you can see orthographics. So right here on the top right, that's your perspective viewport. And then the other 3 viewports are your orthographic viewports. You have your top, front, and side. And minimizing and maximizing viewports cannot be quicker and simpler in Maya. Now I'm going to come back to perspective viewport. I'm going to show you how to navigate inside the perspective viewport. To navigate, hold down the Alt key and then left mouse click and drag to rotate. Then continue holding down the Alt key, and if you right mouse click and drag, this will zoom you in and zoom you out. And if you hold the Alt key and middle mouse click and drag, this will pan you around. And these are the only 3 shortcut keys that you really need to know to navigate inside the perspective viewport. Now, if you also use the mouse wheel, you can kind of step, snap, or zoom in and zoom out. Or I guess move the camera forward and back. And if you need to select an object, you just left click. If you need to deselect any object, you just left click in the empty space. If you select an object, left click and press F, this will frame your view on that selected object. Sometimes you need to frame your view on a smaller object inside the scene or somewhere else. This is a really quick way to orient your scene really quick. So let's say your camera is up here, just select an object, hit F. This will frame your view. And then once you have your view framed, a really good shortcut key is to kind of rotate around the selected object. Hold down Alt and then left mouse click and drag, and this will rotate around your selection. So you can kind of take a look at all around your object really quick. Really good shortcut key to use. If you ever need to maximize the entire viewport, let's say you want to get rid of all the menus all around you, and you just want to have that perspective viewport or the other orthographic viewports to take over the entire screen. You can do this by holding down Control Spacebar. This will maximize and give you full screen. And press Control Spacebar to toggle it back. And to navigate inside the orthographics, you just need to know 2 shortcut keys. So I'm going to hit Spacebar to get access to the orthographics. Now, right now they are in shaded mode, and I'll show you how to switch over to wireframe a little later. But I'm going to go ahead and maximize the top view, place my mouse in the top view viewport and then press spacebar to maximize it. I'm going to hit F to frame that object. And then to navigate, you just continue hold down the Alt key, and then the right mouse button will zoom you in and zoom you out. And then Alt and middle mouse button will pan you around. And then the mouse wheel can zoom you in and zoom you out by step snapping. And that's all you need to know how to navigate inside the viewport. Now let me show you some of the essential viewport option shortcut keys you need to know about. So here I'm inside the perspective viewport, and I already have wireframe on shaded enabled. So by default, here's what you will see. Anytime you create an object, you will have this shaded mode enabled, and you're not going to be able to see wireframe. It's very helpful to turn on wireframe on your shaded objects inside the perspective viewport. To do this, the shortcut key is Alt 5, and this will toggle on and off. And inside the perspective viewport or any other viewport you have in Maya, you will have a toolbar of commonly used icons right here. And this will give you all the options you ever need to kind of either select the camera or change it to wireframe, to shaded. And the icon that's been enabled and disabled right now is wireframe unshaded. So you can come over here as well and enable and disable wireframe unshaded. If you need to take a look at the wireframe mode in perspective viewport, you just hit 4. This gives you wireframe. And the shortcut key that's been enabled right here in the viewport toolbar is this one right here, wireframe. And you can enable shaded, or it's called smooth shade all, by clicking this icon right here. Or pressing 5. So 4 will give you wireframe, 5 will give you smooth shaded all. 6 will give you ability to see your textures. Now I don't have any textures applied onto this object, but if I did, I'll be able to see them inside the viewport. And the icon that's been enabled is this one right here, textured mode. So I'm going to go ahead and disable it since we don't have any textures. 7 will give you lighting mode. So if you had any lights, you'll be able to preview your lights inside the viewport. So if I hit 7, my object will turn black because I don't have any lights. But if we did, we'll be able to see a very rough approximation of what the lighting is doing. And the icon that's been enabled is this one right here. Now let's go back to the orthographic viewports. I'm going to hit spacebar. And I want to go ahead and turn all the viewports, the orthographic viewports, to wireframe. You should have, primarily you should work with smooth shaded mode 5 inside the perspective viewport with the wireframe on shaded enabled. And then you should turn your orthographic viewports all to wireframe. So I'm just going to hover my mouse inside each viewport and hit 4 for wireframe. And that's how I usually work and set up the scene. And let's go back to perspective viewport. So as far as viewport options go, this is all you need to know for now. But there's a lot more that we can go in and dive into, as well as using a lot of these drop-down menus to select your camera, to undo and redo your camera change. You have your shading options. You have your lighting. You can show by enabling and disabling certain actors to show up inside the viewport. You have your ability to choose render and even switch this perspective viewport to something else. But getting started, the shortcut keys that I showed you are enough to begin with. Now, as you begin with Maya, the number one mistake that beginners make is working from a default project. So everything in Maya is organized into a project that contains a set of subfolders. And within those subfolders, this is where you keep your files. This is where the images are being rendered to. This is where you place your textures, so Maya can look into that project directory and know where to look for those textures, as well as where to look for scenes that you are saving. And when you first launch Maya, you will be inside the default directory. And what you should do is set up your own project. And it's extremely quickly to do. You can have as many projects as you want, but you should at least set up one so you know exactly where files are being kept and what project you are working from. So to set up your project, I've covered this in many other videos, but to cover in this video, you simply go to File, Project window. By default, current project will be set to default, and then you just simply click New, give a new name, and then define the location where do you want to save this project into. So I already have a directory, but you can click on this folder icon and set somewhere on your computer where you would want to save your project in which location. And then you're going to have a set of subfolders created by Maya, and I would keep them by its default. You don't need to change anything here, and you just hit accept. Maya will create that project directory, all those subfolders, and Maya environment will be set to that project. So you would be able to go to File, click on Project window to check which current project Maya is using and where it's located. And then if you navigate to that folder and then go inside that folder. Here are all the default subfolders that Maya created. Inside the scenes folder is where all your scenes are being kept, all the Maya files. Inside the source images folder are all your textures. And inside images are any renders that you rendered with Maya. Now let me show you how to start with basic polygon object primitives, how to work with them, and how to access the component mode. So I have an object inside the scene, a cube that I created. I'm just going to go ahead and left click to select it and hit delete. This is how you delete any object inside your scene. And you usually will have just an empty scene with nothing in it, just a grid. To create polygon primitives, you would go to create drop-down menu, polygon primitives, and I'm going to peel off this menu by clicking on this bar right here. So that way I can just create a bunch of primitives and show you how to work with them. So this way I don't have to go up to the drop-down menu every time. And I'm just going to move it over here. So I'm going to left click to create a cube. And here's my cube. It's going to be extremely small. And my grid is very big because I changed the grid that the Maya comes into. So I'm going to show you how to update your grid. But right now, let's just work with what we have. I'm not going to update the grid right now. So by default, the cube will be created in world origin. I'm going to hit F to frame my view. And here's my cube. The world origin is going to be a very important part of your creation. The world origin is going to be always in the center of the world, and you're going to see these two thick lines, black lines that are intersecting. And the object is going to be created in the world origin at 0, 0, 0 world space. To deselect an object, you just left click in the empty space to deselect it. To select an object, left click to select it. If you ever need to delete it, you just simply select the object and delete. This will delete the object. If you need to undo, hit Ctrl Z or Z. This will undo your previous operation. To manipulate or move your objects inside your scene, you have three options. You actually have four. Let's focus on the first three. To get to the Move tool, the shortcut key is W. W will give you access to the Move tool, and you'll also be able to get access to the Move tool right here in the left-hand side toolbar. If you hit E, this will give you Rotate. You can see that E also activates the Rotate tool on the left-hand side toolbar. And then you have R, which is Scale. And the Scale tool is also being activated. So you can use the shortcut keys, of course, that's what I recommend. But you can also come over here and left click to activate, Move, Rotate, and Scale. And then the other tool that usually you will get access to when you first start up Maya or start any new scene is the Select tool, which is going to be this arrow right here. And the shortcut key is Q. This will only allow you to select objects inside the scene and not move them, rotate them, or scale them. So I'm going to hit W to get access to the Move tool. And to move this object, you just simply left click, hold, and drag on any of these gizmos. You have the green arrow, which is the Y, up and down. If you left click, hold, and drag, this will activate and move the object up and down. If you left click, hold, and drag on the red arrow, which is X axis, this will move the object left to right. And then if you left click, hold, and drag on the blue arrow, which is Z axis, it'll allow you to move the object front to back. And if you left click, hold, and drag in the center, this will move the object on X, Y, Z based on your camera perspective, on your camera view as you're looking at the object. Usually you don't do this inside the perspective viewport. Usually you move the object based on X, Y, or Z axes individually. Then if you switch over to rotate, E, you can rotate your object. You have the same kind of gizmos right here. So you left click, hold, and drag to rotate on each of these, depending on how you want to rotate the object. On X, Y, or Z. And then you have scale. If you hit R, switch over to scale. You can scale the object on X, on Y, on Z, or all together uniformly on X, Y, and Z together. Let me go ahead and move this object. I'm going to hit W, zoom out a little bit, and move this cube over here. And actually, let's go ahead and also scale, make it larger, and move it up. Let's create a cylinder. And I'm also going to hit R to scale and scale it uniformly on X, Y, and Z. Left click, hold, and drag, and just move it up. And let's also do a sphere. Create it and move it. And move it up right here. And let's scale it a little bit more. I'm going to left click in empty space to deselect it. And I'm going to show you how to make multiple selections. To select one object, of course, you just left click. If you want to add to a selection, you hold down Shift and left click to add to a selection. If you want to remove from a selection, continue holding down Shift and left click again to remove from your current selection. There's also another key that will only remove from a selection if you hold down Control. Control will only remove and it doesn't add back in. So sometimes you may need to use Control to only remove something from your selection. And then there is Marquee Selection, which is just if you left click, hold and drag outside an empty space, this will create a rectangular selection and anything inside the selection will be selected. So it's a quick way to make multiple selections for many of your objects inside the scene. If you select each object, I want to point out that the channel box will fill in with that object's attributes. So I selected the cube, and if you take a look on the right hand side, here I have the cube and its position in the world, the scale that I applied to it, and right in here you'll have the ability to rename your objects. So if you select your cube and you double click on the name, right here at the top, you can rename this object or anything else. So I'm just going to name it first cube and hit enter. This will rename your object. You can do the same thing for any other objects that you have inside your scene. I'll just do this to the first one. Now we applied scale to this. So we have scale being activated right here. And we also moved it in world origin, or away from the world origin inside the space, inside the world space, and it has coordinates that we translated this object on X and Y. So the channel box will keep track of your movement, your rotation, and your scale that you've done to an object. By default, I'm going to go ahead and marquee select all these, left click, hold, and drag all around them, and hit delete. Let me create a new cube. By default, when you create a cube, everything will be zeroed out, and the scale will be set to 1. So you can scale your objects using move, scale, and rotate gizmos. However, there is a better way to change your object dimensions and their size by actually inputting specific values. So if you select your cube and come over to the channel box, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger right here. I'm just going to left click, hold, and drag to open this up. And you will see inputs. And you will see your very first input, which is the creation of your polygonal object. In our case, it's the cube. If I left click on this icon right here, it'll open me up into ability to set a specific size for the cube. And this is usually the way that I start creating objects. Instead of resizing them and rescaling them, I simply come over here and I enter values. And these values are set in centimeters. So the default cube is only 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. It's extremely small. We'll talk a little bit more about sizing a little later, but usually I set a specific size to this first. So I just simply left click on each of these and change it to the value that I want. So let's say 10 for each of these, or 100 or whatever else. But you can also go ahead and maybe scale it. You can also do this as well. So I'm going to come back into the polycube input, and this option also allows you to set the initial subdivision width, height, and depth. So if you wanted extra segments inside your cube, you can also come in here and change it, maybe let's say 3 by 3 by 3. So this gives you extra segments to work with. There are modeling tools that will allow you to add extra edges, but it's going to be beyond this tutorial and explain more about all the modeling tools in the course. But you can start your initial polygon primitives with specific sizes and given specific amount of segments to be inserted as you begin working on them. And this is usually the way I begin. And the last part to working with primitive shapes is the component mode. Component mode is going to be your go-to for manipulating objects. This allows you to switch over to working with vertices, edges, and faces. So I'm going to come over to our cube. I'm just going to hit W to get access to the move tool. I'm going to zoom in a little closer. And with the object selected, you just simply right click, hold, gives you access to a context menu. And you have ability to change to all of these different components of an object. The object mode is what we are in right now. However, if I right click, hold, I can switch over to vertices and allows me to manipulate by selecting vertices and moving them on this cube. So if I wanted to select a set of vertices, so let's say I'll select this one. Actually, I'll just marquee select the top. And with them selected, I can just go ahead and move these vertices. I can move them one at a time, or I can move them all together by making multiple selections. Then I can switch over to edge, select multiple edges. So I'm holding down shift now, and I can select a set of edges to manipulate. And then I can switch over to a face, and I can select a set of faces to manipulate and move. So this is your kind of first introduction into manipulating primitive shapes by switching over to component level, edges, vertices, or faces, and being able to manipulate them in real time. And this is how you change the shape of an object. And a lot of the times you'll be modeling, by modifying your vertices, edges, and faces. So I'm going to go back to object component level, and now I'm back at an object level and I can manipulate the entire object. So your ability to switch to all these components and work with them is going to be your go-to when you're creating shapes, creating objects, creating models and assets. And then of course on top of that you have all of the modeling tools that are accessible to you to create more complex shapes. You need to set your grid scale to correct proportion, to correct size, so you can judge dimensions and proportions of your environment and everything you create a lot better. So by default in Maya, the grid is extremely small, and that's what I have now, the default settings. And if I am to create a simple cube, so I'm going to go to create polygon primitives, cube. This cube is 1 centimeter in width, height, and depth. So 1 centimeter is 0.39 of inches. So it's like incredibly small. And if you are to continue modeling this as from the default shape, then your object, whatever you create, is not going to match to the scale, to the real world scale of an object, unless the object is actually this size. But a lot of beginners begin to model from this cube only to realize that their prop or their environment incredibly too small, and now they need to scale everything up. So everything you create, everything you model, needs to match the real world scale and dimensions of an actual object. So I recommend for every scene you create, insert a cube and set this cube to a size of an average height of a human, which is about 6 feet tall. So taking this cube, I'm going to go into the input tab and I'm going to change width and depth to 50. So it's going to be 50 centimeters and height is going to be set to 180. 180 centimeters is roughly 6 feet. And now if I go ahead and zoom out, you can see this is good representation of a human height and human depth and width. So if I take this cube and now raise it up, you can see that the scale of our grid is incredibly small. Now, if I were to take and start creating objects, I can at least judge my dimensions better by looking at this height of a character. And now I can create any prop or any environment and reference it back to the scale reference and at least model it to some accuracy in terms of its dimensions and proportion. However, now we need to change our scale of the grid. To do this, go up to Display, Grid, and click on this little box. These are your options for the grid. Change the length and width to a very large value. This is going to be the size of the grid inside your viewport. So I usually change it to 1000 and then increase it if I need it. So let's do 1000 to this. And let's hit apply to see what it looks like. All right, so that's the overall size inside the viewport. Then let's change subdivision to 1. You should change this to 1 and leave it. Never change it back to anything else other than 1. This will allow you to take each grid unit and have a specific value assigned with it, meaning that you'll be able to know what size of each of these grid units are. And all you need to do is change grid lines every so many units. This is the grid unit in centimeters. So right now it's set to 5. So this means that each grid unit is 5 centimeters. I usually keep this at 10. So I'm going to change it to 10 and hit apply. So now each grid unit is 10 centimeters. And this gives you very accurate representation of being able to create things on the grid if you need it, for example, for modular environment design. But these are the settings that I start with. And if I ever need to change my grid size of each unit, of each grid, I change it here for grid lines every so many units. And if I happen to need to make this entire grid larger inside the viewport, I can change this and increase it. But to begin with, set these values and keep them as they are. And this will be a good starting point. And one last part, I want to show you that Maya is set by default to centimeters. Go to Windows. Actually, let's go ahead and close this. Apply and close. Go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and then Preferences. And then click on Settings. And right here you have working units set to centimeters. You should not change it unless a project calls for it. But in my experience, I've never had to change this to anything else. But this is where you would change it if you ever need it for a specific project or you're working somewhere and it's required for you to change to one of these working units. But keep it to centimeters, don't change it, but just wanted to show you where it's at. The number one problem that beginners have when they begin to create environments and props is incorrect scale, dimensions, and proportions, especially for environments. The environment is either too big or too small. Now we already set our grid and we already inserted to have a human reference scale of roughly 6-foot person standing inside our environment, inside that scene. So that greatly helps. And here you can see in this scene, I actually have quite a few of these boxes all over the scene to help me judge proportion of the environment I'm creating, or not creating, but blocking things out. And that's the point that I'm trying to make here in this principle is block things out before you model anything. Blocking out is a process of using basic primitive shapes to define the overall shape, dimensions, and scale of the environment or objects you are going to model. And you can see nothing has been actually modeled here. I used basic primitive shapes that I showed you before by going to create polygon primitives and using these right here. I've used cubes, cylinders, and that's pretty much it. That's all I used. And I blocked out an environment based on a photo reference, this one right here, as an exercise that we do inside the course to show you how to quickly block things out. So before you start modeling anything and adding those doors, those windows, and actually focusing on the detail of anything in any environment, you need to get the size, the proportion, the scale, the dimensions correct. And you do this by bringing over primitive shapes, changing over to component level, faces, vertices, and edges, moving those edges, moving those vertices, moving those faces, scaling these primitive shapes, inserting a bunch of these human scale references all over your scene so you can judge everything you are blocking out and that it looks correct to the photo reference as well as it matches to the human reference scale inside the scene. And once you've done the blockout process, then you can go into and begin modeling everything you see to more detail and to what actually you will be using to render or maybe export to a game engine and use it as part of your environment creation there. But the blockout process is your first step, and you should block out as much as you can, from simple props to small rooms and of course to bigger environments which require you to block things out to get the right size of them down first. So block out before you begin modeling anything. Learn to use shortcut keys. So I already showed quite a few shortcut keys for you to use. So for example, selecting an object and then switching to move, rotate, and scale, you have W, E, R. You should never come over here to the left hand side and then switch to rotate, then try to rotate, then go back, move your mouse over here, switch to scale or move, then go back to an object. You need to utilize as many shortcut keys as possible. This will speed up your modeling workflow tremendously. You will find many default shortcut keys whenever you use the drop-down menu for anything. Just always note that if you are continuously repeating something over and over again, note that there is a shortcut key. So for example, a modeling tool bevel has Control B, extrude, Control E. Some of these will always list something that you can use right away. I personally do not like using custom shortcut keys or setting them myself. I like to use the default. So this way, if I ever jump over to another version of Maya on another computer, I'll be able to use whatever is there right away without having to find my settings, find my shortcut keys, import them into work. So I always use the default. A few more shortcut keys that I want to point out that you should start utilizing right away. Of course, you have your right-click hold to switch over to edge, vertex, and face, and all these different components. You also have shift, right-click hold. This will give you modeling context menu, and a lot of the modeling tools that don't even have a shortcut key will be accessible here. So instead of coming up to a drop-down menu at the top, shift, right-click hold can switch you to most of your modeling tools that you will ever use. You also have control and shift, hold, control shift down, and then right-click hold. This will give you access to axis orientation change. So you can change to move the object in world space, at an object level, at a component level, as well as a few more options here, such as ability to preserve UVs and so on. And this is control shift right-click hold. And the way you access these inside a menu, you have to double click on the move tool settings, or on the rotate, or on scale. And axis orientation changes right here. So you can see it would take multiple steps in order to change this through a menu. But why do that when you have a shortcut key? Control shift right click. And then you also have the hotbox. If you hold down the spacebar, this gives you access to all of the drop-down menus for everything you need. So instead of coming up here in the drop-down menus at the top, or even switching over to any of the other menu sets, holding spacebar gives you access to them very quick. So here you can even go to create and create another object. And last, whenever you get into modeling, in addition to holding down Shift, right click, hold, getting access to all the modeling tools here, you have the modeling toolkit. So on the right hand side, you will have a tab right below attribute editor to switch to modeling toolkit. So this is just a quick mouse over to most of the commonly used modeling tools. And if you do not see your modeling toolkit tab here, make sure you enable this icon at the top right below workspace. So if you don't see it, just make sure you have it on. And one last thing I want to point out, when you hold down Shift, right click, hold, this gives you access to modeling tools for the object. If you switch over to a component, to a face, vertex, or edge, let's say I'll switch over to a face, and then I hold down Shift, right click, the menu will change based on my component selection. So now I can work with a face and deal with the face and model it and do whatever I need to do with it. And the menu has changed because I have a face component level selected. And this will change if you have vertices or edges switched over. Many of the tools you will use will have options. Just like when we did our grid update, anytime you see a small little box next to any of these drop-down menus, this will open up a set of options for that. So you can see that there's options for many of these. So if I go to some of the modeling tools, you can see pretty much everything has an option box. And if you open that up, let's say we open up, let's go to extrude. A menu will open up and you can enter default settings to be changed. So whenever you use the extrude tool, this will be updated to whatever you set. So if you wanted to extrude not with one division every time, but with 3 or 4, you'll go in here and you'll update. So if I, let's say I delete this cube and I go to create polygon primitives, even the creation of polygon primitives has an option box. So let's go to cube. And let's say I wanted to create a cube every time and not 1 centimeter in width, height, and depth. But let's say I wanted to do 100 every time. And then not with divisions of 1, but maybe 3. I'm going to hit apply. This will create the cube and it will remember the settings. So if I go ahead and close this, delete the cube, and now every time I create a cube, those settings will be remembered. So you can update this for any of the tools that has an option box. However, sometimes tools don't work the way you expect them to because you might have changed the default settings. And if you want to ever revert back to the default, you can do that by going to whatever tool you're working with you want to reset to. I'm going to go back to the cube option box. And every single one of them will have edit, and you'll be able to reset settings back to default. So now every time you create, it'll be back to what you expect it to. Snapping your objects and controlling their pivot points is extremely important for your environment creation or for any object creation, especially if you're doing something in game environments and creating modular assets. So you have to learn the shortcut keys for snapping your objects to either the grid or other objects, as well as how to modify pivot points. So at the very top toolbar right here below, you have below the drop-down menus, you have 3 options to for your ability to snap to the grid. So if you enable this, you can now left click and drag and snap to the grid. I'm going to duplicate this object, Control D. To duplicate objects, you just select it and press Control D to duplicate. I'm going to go ahead and come up here and disable. So this first one is snap into grid. The second one is going to be snap into curves or edges. So if I enable this and if I middle mouse click, and instead of using the left mouse click and drag to snap things, I recommend that you switch over to using the middle mouse click and drag to snap things and moving objects around. This is going to be a more predictable way, especially when you start snapping objects and modifying the pivot points. Middle mouse click is far better shortcut key to use than the left mouse click. So if I wanted to snap to a edge, activate the edge component mode or curves, middle mouse click and drag on a curve or on an edge or curve, and it will start snapping. And the third option is snapping to points or vertices. So I'm going to enable this, and then middle mouse click and drag over another vertex of an object, and it'll start snapping to that vertex. So these are ability for you to enable this inside the toolbar. However, shortcut keys are way better. So to snap objects using shortcut keys, first one is holding down X and middle mouse click and drag. And in this case, I'm going to middle mouse click and drag right over the center where the pivot point is, and I can start snapping to the grid. Second one is snapping to curves or edges. So if you hold down C, and then middle mouse click and drag over an edge where you want to snap this object to. It's going to start snapping to those edges. And then if you want to snap to vertices of another object, hold down V and middle mouse click and drag over vertices where you want to snap this object to. And all these objects will always snap at its pivot point. So this is why it's overlapping, because it's snapping where the pivot point is. So this ability for you to snap objects to the grid, to edges, and to vertices is extremely important. And remember, they will always be snapped at their pivot point. So that means if you want to snap an object precisely on top of another object, you must control that pivot point of that object first, and then you snap it. So if you want to modify where this pivot point appears on an object, you hold down D. As soon as you hold down D, the gizmo will change, and then you can drag XYZ gizmo anywhere to reposition that pivot point. And then when you let go of the D key, that pivot point is now in that new position. And now you can go ahead and snap this new pivot point on another vertex, let's say. Hold down V, middle mouse click and drag. However, let's say you want to snap that pivot point more precisely somewhere else. So I'm going to hold down D, and we can use the same shortcut keys for snapping objects, but now I'm going to snap my pivot point. So with D pressed down, if I want to snap this pivot point to the grid, I'm going to hold down D and X, and then middle mouse click and drag my mouse away from the pivot point, because I want to snap it to the grid, let's say in this location. And now I'm snapping that pivot point to the grid. If I let go of the X and the D key, now here's my new pivot point. Let me undo. If I want to snap this pivot point at a vertex of this object, I'm going to hold down D and V, and then middle mouse click and drag over the vertex where I want to snap that pivot point to. Then let go of everything, and now that's my new pivot point. And the last one, if you want to snap this pivot point along an edge, so I'm going to hold down D to enter pivot point modification, hold down C, and then middle mouse click and drag over an edge where I want to snap it to, and just drag it. And let's say that's my new pivot point. Or if I choose to, I can just drag it down all the way to the vertex until it snaps. So I'm basically snapping at an edge, but then you can also always just go ahead and just snap it down to a vertex. Up to you. And then you simply, once you're happy with this position, you just let go of everything. That's my new pivot point. And with that new pivot point, I can hold down V, middle mouse click and drag, and now my object will snap on top of another object precisely and extremely accurately without ever overlapping. And this ability for you to snap your objects and modify your pivot points and snap those pivot points anywhere you want is a must, and you have to master these and be extremely proficient with them. Start a custom tool shelf. By default, when you have Maya installed, it will come with the default set of shelves that you can use to get access to some of the most commonly used tools in Maya. So for example, right here, if you switch over to any of these tabs, such as Poly Modeling Tool Shelf, it'll give you access to some of the commonly used modeling tools right away. So instead of going to some of these drop-down menus, they will be placed as icons right here for you to use. So in the Poly Modeling one, the first few have primitive shapes already added. So let me delete this one. So instead of coming up to create polygon primitive and choosing what you want to create, you can just choose to create a cube, choose to create a cylinder, and they'll be created for you. And there's a lot more added here that you can use right away. However, you want to create your own. So I'm going to show you how to create one. Come over here to the gear icon on the left click, and then choose new shelf. New menu will pop up and it just tells you to name your new shelf. So let's just name it Secret Shelf and just click OK. It will be empty and it will be active. So you want to make sure that your shelf is active, but you've created your own shelf. And now you just need to add more icons. So what you add here is the tools that you use most often. So let's add a few polygon primitives that we constantly create. And you can use the same shortcut key to add anything else. So to add anything as an icon into your shelf, make sure it's active, then hold down Control, Shift, and then go into any of the drop-down menus. So let's go to Create in this case, Polygon Primitives, and I'm going to click on the cube. And as long as you keep pressed Control and Shift, you can add anything you want to your custom tool shelf. So let's do a plane, let's do a sphere. Then I'm going to let go of Control and Shift, clear everything, and we have added 4 icons. Then let's add a few more, just so we have a little bit of variety. So a very common modeling tool that you would constantly use is Extrude. So I'm going to hold down Control, Shift, and I'm going to go to Edit Mesh and add Extrude. It does have a shortcut key, so you don't really need it, but I just wanted to add something else, something extra. And here it's added. And of course you can just go any of these menus and add anything you need, so you don't have to go to the drop down menu constantly all the time. You'll have it on your shelf. And the more you use Maya, you'll know what to add for your own custom shelf. If you want to delete an item from your shelf, so let's say I don't want to use a sphere, you can just right click on that icon and just choose delete. There's a lot more customization that I go through in the course, such as how to add little separators. So when you click over to Poly Model and you have little separators that are added in to separate different functionalities, different categories of what you want, and you just want more organization within your tool shelf, I'll show you how to do that. And we also go through ability to customize and add more to your shelf. So if you go to the gear icon, you can go to Shelf Editor. And there's a lot more you can go through here, such as add icon preview, you can add an icon label, you can add a tooltip when you hover over it. So if I wanted to add something to this cube, I can just say cube as an icon label. I can modify and move a lot of these and reorganize them. And then I can save all shelves. And now we have a little preview being displayed in my shelf, as well as if I hover over, it gives me a tooltip. You want to begin to utilize display layers and isolate select shortcut key. So display layers will allow you to create a layer, then place certain objects onto it. So you can either turn off their visibility, so they're now no longer in scene, distracting you or cluttering your viewport. Or you can turn some of those display layers into non-selectable objects or into a wireframe that will not be able to be selected, such as a template view. And they're a great way to have some kind of like a blueprint or a template. For example, your blackout scene that you place onto a layer, turn everything to a very light wireframe, and then you begin to create. So you have a reference template to match to, but it's not overpowering your viewport. So to do this, I have a few objects created. I'm just going to place them on their own display layers and give you a brief overview. So I'm going to select the sphere, and I'm going to come over here to the right bottom of the interface, and I have display enabled, and it's always enabled. But you also have animation layers, which we're not going to use because this is used for animation only. And let's say I want to create a new layer, and I want to place a selected object onto that layer. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to click on this fourth icon. This creates a new layer and assigns the selected object onto it. So here I have a new layer. And right now, all I'm going to show you at the moment is you can disable the visibility. So this object has been assigned to this layer 1. So I can left click and it will turn the visibility off. Very helpful. I can also select another cube and add it to an existing layer. So I can select this layer 1, right click on it, and it gives me a set of options. So I can go ahead and add selected object. And now I have 2 objects selected and placed onto that layer. And this third icon, this creates an empty new layer. So whether I have something selected or not, so let's say I have a cylinder selected. If I click on the third icon, nothing will be placed because I did not click the fourth icon, which also assigns the selected object. So you can just create a new layer, and if you wanted to place something onto it, you just have to select it, then right click on it and add selected object. Let's come back to layer 1. If I wanted to remove one of the objects away from that layer, I would just select that object, right click on that layer, and I can just remove selected object. And if I wanted to delete the layer, just right click on that layer and choose delete layer. Nothing will be removed from it, the layer is deleted, but the object stays. And one last option is the ability for you to lock some of these objects onto it. So if you come over here to this third icon, which is an empty window right now, I'm just going to deselect this object because it's on that layer. If you left click on one and turn it into a template, you'll get the wireframe. You won't be able to select it, but you'll see it. If you left click again, it'll turn it into a reference. So you will not be able to select it, but it will be fully visible. And if you left click on it again, it goes back to regular selection. And if you need to rename this layer, just double click and rename it. And save. So these layers are extremely helpful to organize your scenes. And one last shortcut key is Control 1. Control 1 allows you to select an object and isolate it. Basically, you will see the object selected, but hide everything else from view temporarily. And that shortcut key is Control 1. Control 1 will toggle the unselected objects on and off. And the little icon key that's enabled and disabled can also be accessed in the viewport toolbar right here. If you come over to this right here, which has an arrow, kind of like a cube, this is Isolate Select. Of course, Control 1 is the shortcut key you want to use. And Isolate Select also works at a component level. So if you select a set of faces, and you want to isolate them and just work with them only, Control 1 will isolate the selected faces. And this works for vertices and edges as well. And press Control 1 to bring everything back. Enable heads-up display. So inside the viewport, I already have heads-up display enabled. By default, you will not see it. So it's this right here. It will display vertices, edges, faces, triangles, and UVs inside your scene. This is extremely helpful for troubleshooting, as well as just seeing how dense your scene is, as well as any of the selected objects or selected components. To enable this, go to Display, Heads-up Display, and make sure you have Poly Count enabled. The first column will display all objects inside the scene, whether they're selected or not. The second column will display selected objects. And the third column applies to a component mode. So if I select a set of vertices, it will display how many verts I have selected. And this also applies to faces. So enable this heads-up display and keep it. In the last part of this video, I want to show you the 11 modeling tools that you should focus on as you begin to learn Maya. And these 11 will give you pretty much everything you need to get started modeling. There's a lot more than 11, and we cover these 11 with all the options that you need to know, as well as a lot more inside the Maya Foundation Home Study course. But I'm going to point them out what they are, so you know. You can get access to most of these in the drop-down menu, as well as inside the modeling toolkit. So I'm going to open up the modeling toolkit. Number 1 is Extrude. This allows you to create new faces and new edges from existing geometry. Number 2 is Bevel. This allows you to round out the corners of your geometry. Number 3 is Multi-Cut. This allows you to create new edges and insert edge loops into your models. Number 4 is Connect, and allows you to create additional edges in between selected geometry. Number 5 is Circle Rise, which can be found under Edit Mesh, Circle Rise. And this allows you to create rounded geometry from flat planes or from rounded surfaces. This creates far more complex geometry, such as if you have a flat plane, you can have a cylinder coming out of it. Number 6 is Combine, Separate, and Extract. Combine and Separate can be found under Mesh. Combine and Separate. This allows you to combine multiple objects into one, and Separate allows you to separate combined objects away from each other. And Edit Mesh has the Extract, which allows you to select a face or a set of faces and extract them as a separate object. Number 7 is Bridge. Bridge allows you to create, or more like connect, a set of faces or edges within the same mesh with additional faces. Number 8 is Target Weld. This allows you to merge vertices or edges together. Number 9 is Booleans. And actually, I don't like using this option right here. I usually use Mesh Booleans. And Booleans allow you to merge objects together into one. And there's a different set of options here. You can combine them or merge them as union. You can subtract them. You can keep the intersection. And there's quite a lot of options here. Booleans allow you to create far more complex shapes than anything else in Maya would allow you to do so. Number 10 is controlling soft and hard edges, which are going to be available under Mesh Display, Harden and Soften Edge. These two allow you to control the visibility of hard and soft edges on your model, thus resulting in how your models will actually look rendered out or inside the game engine. And number 11, Reverse, which is also found on the Mesh Display, Reverse. This allows you to invert face normals on faces that are rendered inside out, thus controlling your end result of your models and also how they're rendered out or how they appear inside the game engine. Now we go through all of those options, how to use each of those modeling tools, and how to apply them to an actual prop and environment to create with inside the course. So everything we covered in this video is just tip of the iceberg. It's just the beginning. So I recommend that you pick up and download Maya Foundation Home Study course. In there we go deeper into modeling, into UVing, and a lot more into getting started with Maya as a complete beginner. So if you're switching software and you need to pick up Maya, or if you've never used the 3D software before and you want to learn the industry standard, then you need this course. You'll see a link in the description, and you'll also see a link if you are on the blog post. And let's begin.